Okay, welcome to the DaVinci Resolve 16 tutorial. I'll be focusing on editing today. So we're going to see how we can get through an edit using Resolve without getting too distracted by its other features such as coloring. And we won't go into too much Fairlight stuff, but we will have a look at its audio capabilities as well. But it's just a brief sort of intro end-to-end workflow. If you go online to download Resolve, which is free, by the way, for the free version that we're using today, you'll be pointed towards the Resolve 16 download page, and that will give you the latest version of Resolve. But you may or may not want the latest version. I'm pointing out to you now that the latest version does not understand all of the camera file types that you might need it to. For example, the Sony FS7 won't be natively understood in 16.2 or 16.1. So I had to go back to 16.0 to get it to work with FS7 files because of the way it manages the encoding of the files is misunderstood by the newer versions of Resolve. So the Blackmagic Support Center is your place to go to. So just search Download Center or Support Center. This, by the way, is where you go to if you need different support for all of its hardware products, all of Blackmagic's different options for hardware. But all the Resolve versions are listed here in the left column. And you might need to go back to 16.0 if, for example, you've shot with an FS7. It really depends on the sorts of footage that you're using as to which version of Resolve you'll need. My recommendation is by starting off on the latest version, see if it works for you, and if it doesn't, roll back to 16.0 or get in touch and I can maybe help you troubleshoot what's going on with your particular files. Also, you'll need to have certain system specifications to be able to run DaVinci Resolve smoothly. So you'll need a good processor, you'll need enough RAM, recommended is 32 gig plus, and you'll need good VRAM as well. So that means a good graphics card with available RAM. Nowadays, a lot of people edit from their laptops, and that doesn't really cut it when it comes to video intensive programs. But more and more people are using external graphics cards and the likes of that. So without going down to that rabbit hole, I'd just say that it will do its job as it can, depending on what your resources are that you're offering Resolve. Also, there's a great DaVinci Resolve training center on the website. There's loads of videos, various hardware interoperability instructions there. Some of it is a bit sort of corporate. They're trying to get you to buy into the family of products, but nonetheless, there's some really good PDFs here. Beginner's Guide to DaVinci Resolve, PDF, Advanced Editing, and Fairlight Audio Post. These are good documents that are obviously searchable by doing Ctrl F if you're on a Windows. So do spend the time to just sort of know where they are, at least have them at your disposal. Throughout the course of this tutorial, you might find it useful to use my favorite shortcut, Alt and Tab, to change between different windows. I've got a lot of stuff open here. But yeah, you might want to press Alt and Tab to change between the YouTube tutorial that you're watching and your own version of Resolve so that you can cross-reference things. So feel free to press spacebar to stop the YouTube video, do Alt and Tab, and on Mac it's similar to allow you to change between programs easily. Who needs a second display when you've got Alt Tab skills, eh? I mean, I still want a second display, but hey, there we go. So with Resolve, you're going to come to this landing page. It's going to look something along the lines of this. And you may or may not have the databases visible on the left. So you might need to expand here. The database file is a metadata file that links together a lot of the back-end settings of your project. And the database file is going to need to be created if this is the first time you're running Resolve. If you've already been working on another machine on a project, then you're going to need to connect a new database file on this machine. That means pointing it to the server directory where you've got it saved, wherever you've got it saved on the server. And that means that you can work on different computers seamlessly as long as you've got access to the same database file on the server. If you're like me, you're at home, you're only working on one machine, you can create a local database file and you can point it to somewhere on the computer where you know you've got all your safe files. I mean, you could create a project folder and then within that create a database folder so you know exactly where that file is for the particular project you're working on. That would be the smart thing to do. I'm working off a database file already, so I've got my projects listed here and I can see the formats and I can see the frame rates and I can see the amount of timelines and the dates that they've been created, and I can organize them as such and display them in different views. You can also search here if you've got more than the eye can see, and you can create a new project down here. I'm going to keep things very simple to start off with, and then after a while I'm going to show you a few more tricks in a built-out project, but we're going to keep it very simple in a new project to start off. Let's say Resolve 101. It's going to take a moment to open the new project. You can see it's named up there. And it's brought us to the edit screen because perhaps that was the last screen that I had open. But it might bring you to any number of these different screens at the bottom. And that's the first thing to note about Resolve, is that it's trying to ultimately funnel you through its start to end workflow for all of your editing needs and coloring needs. It wants you to use the media tab to find your footage and assemble it into this pool by selecting where it lives and then just selecting the clips and dragging them into the media pool. Those clips in the media pool will then be accessible in the subsequent tabs, the first of which you can skip if you want to. I don't really use the cut tab. It's for topping and tailing mostly. Some people like to set their in-out marks here. Yeah, personally, I would go straight to the edit tab and manage it there instead, because we can actually drag in our footage into a bin straight away in the editing tab. So you won't see me use the cut one. You won't see me use the fusion one, which is for more advanced node-based effects. I'll dip into the coloring one very briefly just to show you how it correlates, which is really nice, which is why we use Resolve most of the time, other than its free price tag. We will be dipping into the Fairlight tab because we have to. It does force us to use the Fairlight tab because it's not enough in the edit tab, and that's my main gripe with Resolve. But I do love free software, so I live with that, and I hope they build it out and improve it in the future, which I'm sure they will. And the last tab, the spaceship, is for delivery, which is nice and straightforward. So let's get some stuff going in the edit tab, and you can see everything's looking quite empty here. There's no clips in the media pool. I'm not going to populate that. I'm just going to go straight into the edit tab. I'm going to reveal a folder. Hopefully got enough space to do this on my desktop. I'm going to reveal a folder that I've got ready called 1080. Let's just pretend that I've shot in 1080. 1920 by 1080 being our standard HD resolution at 25 frames a second. Unless you have a good reason to, that will be how you've shot. And you should always know how you've shot. You shouldn't be going in blind. So let's see. I'm just going to manage this a bit better so I can see at the bottom where we are here. I'm going to click and drag this folder in. Before I do, make sure to manage your folders properly at your OS level before you do anything in any NLE such as Resolve, Media Composer, or Premiere, because you want your folders and your bins in your Finder to match exactly what's going on in the program. Otherwise, you'll have continuity issues and it will become stressful to troubleshoot things. So that's to be advised. I've just got some clips here. I'm going to click and drag this. Whoops, I accidentally pressed the right click as I was doing that, so I think it cancelled it. So let me do that again. Right over here, you can put them in the clip view, but I'm going to put it in the master, just underneath the master. and it's saying the clips have a different frame rate than the current project settings. Would you like to change your timeline frame rate and video format to match? I'm going to press change. And what that's referring to is our timeline has been set at a different resolution than what the clips are. So let me just explain a bit about that before we go any further, because it's important to understand the master settings and how they're related to the clips. Let me just expand this. We don't need to see the files in the bin anymore. Okay, so we're still in the Edit tab. We're going to stay here for a while. And let me just point you to the project settings, which are down here on the right. These project settings correspond to the project that we're working in, which lives in the database. All the settings within here are specific to this one project. So if I go home and open a different project within the database, there might be different project settings depending on what's going on. However, there are some settings called preferences that are the master DaVinci Resolve preference settings that are across everything, every project. And this refers to where your things like where your cache folders, files are being saved, and your video and audio hardware settings, depending on how you're patched to physical hardware for listening to sound and monitoring. So these are master preference settings, and you can have some user level ones there, but there's a difference. Those preference settings are across everything, whereas we're talking about project settings here. So the project is now defined as per the videos which have come in, which were forced to 1920 by 1080, that's HD. Your timeline resolution can be different to the clips that you're bringing in, but you should always have the timeline following from the clips if you know what the clips are and you want that to carry through to the end of your workflow. If not, then your timeline might be something else, and it might be cropping or resizing or letterboxing or pillarboxing in your project. So it needs to be the same. And if you're working in 4K, be extra careful because it actually doesn't do true 4K. It does UHD, but not true 4K. So it might actually change your aspect ratio without you realizing. There's a really good guide on Moodle Mask about aspect ratios, or you can just ask me directly in the comments, by the way. But just be aware, the free version of Resolve does not do true 4K. So let's keep things nice and HD, square pixels, 25 frames. And I think it's a good idea to set the input scaling to center crop with no resizing. Again, we're trying to discourage automatic stretching of videos and stuff like that. So I like this setting. And if you're making a documentary, let's say in 4K using archive footage, a lot of documentaries actually, they have frames to represent the old non-HD material from VHS. You know, no one wants to see low-res footage scaled up into 4K. It looks awful, so just be aware of those things. Okay, great. So this, by the way, is our media pool area, and we know by looking at the tab here, that's white, that that's our media pool. And we can get rid of these things, and we can view them as we need to. Right now we're focused on our media, so we want this one. And our master view here is showing us our bins. So this is actually a bin. We can make a new bin. Let's say if we want timelines, or we can have stills, graphics, whatever we need in there, assets. This is a bin effectively is what I'm getting at. And we can have it display in thumbnail view or list view. We can search it, and we can change some of the options there. I'm going to put it back. I'll leave it in this thumbnail view. I want to show you that by selecting everything, the audio and video clips together, and right-clicking, we have the option to essentially run an audio sync based on the waveform, which is super handy. If you're not using timecode, you're going to need to rely on these things unless you want to manually sync up a ton of audio clips to video clips. Mind you, that should be no big deal either if everything's labeled properly. So I'll show you later on how I label my files, but for now we're going to keep things super simple, and that's how you would build out your timeline based on the waveform auto sync. Let's just stop again and realize that dragging a clip to the timeline isn't always the best thing. It depends how you like to edit. I'm going to hold this, I'm not going to drop it yet, because you can see the timeline is being created in the bin, and the timeline is going to be generated from the clip settings there. But why don't we double click on the clip? Because setting the in and out point in the source monitor is a smart thing to do. So we just scrub, we press I and O for in and out. And we then have different ways of getting this to the timeline, which means we're managing our clips before we drop them on the timeline. If we go and just indiscriminately drop all of our clips on the timeline, which is called a string out edit, by the way, then we're creating a scary timeline. Why don't we make it very lean and just get on there what we need? So they're grayed out now, but there are some buttons that remind us how we insert clips or overwrite clips to the timeline. There's some shortcuts for those. We'll be going through these. But essentially, you can click and drag, and that has now generated the audio track, and it's brought in that portion only of the clip onto the timeline. And once we have the timeline, we then have our options for editing. So, of course, I can do Ctrl Z, and I can undo that. And if I wanted to, I could go back and I could mark a different portion of the clip. It goes a bit shaky near the end. And I could drag it down again. A nice shortcut is the Alt button. If we hold Alt and drag to the timeline, it will disregard the sound. And that's important because if you're not careful, you will accidentally overwrite your sound with scratch audio. So I would say, unless you need the sound, always hold the Alt key as you drag in footage. So I've got a lot of different things going on here. I'm just going to find something that doesn't look completely terrible. This is all just test shots. And if I drag this in, for example, you can see how it's snapping nicely to the adjacent clip because the snap is enabled by default, and we can press N if we want to toggle snapping. Depends how accurate we want to be with our frames. We can still be accurate with snapping on. It's just sometimes we need to place particularly onto a frame. And this button here is the linking. So if I click a audio or a video clip, it's going to be linked as default unless I deselect the linking. Be aware of that. It can catch you out. It's caught me out for sure before. So knowing when to link and unlink is super handy. So they're the main things to just be aware of at a very basic level. Improving from that, let's try and get some audio. I don't know why the default doesn't show you the sound, but we need to make sure audio waveforms is enabled, and then audio view options we set to show us the wave. So there's nothing on this clip which isn't helpful, but you'll see later on that really helps. It really comes into its own. There's different ways of viewing sound. So park that for now. We'll come back to that. Firstly, just to get around the very basic mechanics of how Resolve works, I'm going to just have a couple of files in here. Keep it super simple, otherwise it gets just gets too much. So I'm going to make the best of my screen real estate by toggling things on and off. Okay, so by the way, instead of, if I want to go to the edit point there, instead of clicking and dragging, like I say, we can use these insert or overwrite. So let's say I want a portion of this clip here, but I want it in the middle of this long one. Scrub there, I can click and drag, and then it just go ahead, it just inserts it, it overwrites it there. Fair enough. maybe we don't want it to move the adjacent footage to the side. Let's just demonstrate this here. It'll make more sense here. If I drop this in overwrite mode, it will just write over that portion of the adjacent clips. That might not be what I want. So in which case I might want to insert it instead. So if I press F9, it will insert it and it will shuffle along the neighboring clips. So the default by dragging is actually overwriting. So the default is as if you're pressing F10. So just be aware of that. Now I know you've got a lot of questions. We'll get on to all of this. We just have to follow a very logical order. First things first, J, K, and L will play back your clips. And you can do that either in the source monitor or the record monitor. Okay, so if you want to play back a portion of a clip, you can just go down to the record, play that back, and you can also change your playback in your source. J is backwards, K is stop, L is forwards. Tap J twice to go back twice as fast, L twice to go forward twice as fast, and hold 1 while pressing the stop button if you want to go slowly. So there's some basic tools that you can actually find across any NLEs. They're the most common editing tools. So what if we want to move at single frame increments? Well, we can press left and right, and you'll see frame by frame we're going to get a movement. So that can be useful. Also, if we hold shift while doing left and right, it's 1 second intervals, so that looks like stop motion. So that can be quite useful. Massively useful is just up and down. Up goes to the previous end of frame or start of frame, and down goes to the next one. So if you've got a huge sequence with loads of stuff loaded in, you can really quickly change between them. So up and down is a super handy shortcut. Now, a point of confusion to wrap this up. Zooming is one of the most important things to have working smoothly, because you're just not going to have a enjoyable edit unless you're zooming properly. You can see there's a zoom slider here. That's fine for a while, but you know, it's kind of a slow way to get in and out the whole time. The most natural thing to do is to use a keyboard shortcut, which is plus and minus. Something strange happens when you try to do that with Resolve. Plus doesn't work, but minus does. So you can zoom out, but you can't zoom in. That's because the zoom in shortcut is actually Shift plus by default. So it's Shift plus to get in and just minus by itself to come out. Isn't that strange? I think so. So I've got a better option for you, which is what you'd be doing anyways, I think, in other softwares. If you hold the Alt button and position the mouse pointer over the footage itself on the timeline, you can use the scrub wheel to go in and out. If you're not holding the mouse pointer over the footage itself, let's say you're on the ruler, well then it's going to move it back and forward. You need to be over the footage itself to come in and out. So as long as you know this, you don't need to be lost looking for the plus and minus either on the interface or on the keyboard. You can just press Alt without looking, and that will help you come in and out. So that's pretty handy, I would say. Okay, let's talk a bit about marking clips, and then we'll look at moving them around. So a selection on a clip is one thing, but having the cursor somewhere is something else. So those are two different things, just to point that out for a start. Let's say we want to mark an in-out point on a clip. Well, how did we do that? Why don't we scrub over this clip? We'll select this clip, but we'll have it scrubbed over here. And let's say we want to mark it. Well, there's a shortcut to do it. It's X. So if you press X, you will see that it doesn't mark the clip that's selected. It marks the scrubbed clip. Okay, so that's X to set the in and out points. Once you've set the in and out points, you can hold Shift and press I to go to an in point, and Shift and O to go to an out point, irrespective of where you are on the timeline. Shift I goes to in, Shift O to out. But what if I wanted to have this clip to be the one that marks in out on the timeline? Well, it's a different shortcut, and it's Shift A, which is mark selected clips. So Shift A marks the clip that's selected, not with the cursor. Okay, so there's a bit of a difference there. If I select this, it's Shift A, because it follows the selection of the clip, Shift A. Otherwise, it will follow X for following where the cursor is. So two different shortcuts and two different ways of clearing them as well. If I want to clear a selection, let's say I've got everything selected on the timeline, Ctrl A, everything selected. How do I clear everything? Well, Ctrl Shift and A will do that. Ctrl Shift and A. It deselects everything on selected tracks. Be very aware of which tracks are selected, because that can trip up as well. So Shift Ctrl A clears all selected clips, but it's still showing me the marked area. And that's a different shortcut to get rid of the marked area. So to clear markers, it's Alt X. Two different shortcuts for clearing the two different ways, because we mark in two different ways as well. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, moving on now. We've got some basic transport controls. We've got loop as well. Let's say we want to loop a clip. Well, firstly, we might press loop, scrub over. We could press X to mark it as well. Play it back and see what happens. Loop is enabled. Okay, looping there is for the source, and here is for the record. So it's just good to know the difference between the two, because you want to loop the record for when you're processing, previewing different effects. It's going back to the start of the timeline there. Slightly odd. You would think it would loop the marked point. I'll have to look up on that. Okay, so you can toggle loop with Control and / if it was working properly. Snapping is very important as well. As I mentioned, if you've got a lot of audio going on, it's going to snap to any cuts that are happening underneath the actual segments. And you can see it's even doing that with the cursor itself. And it's doing it with the mark in and out points also. So snapping is pretty handy. Like linking, you want to be really changing the snap behavior as you go through the edit, and you want to know when to snap and when to come off of it. So these tools are here. We've already talked about inserting versus overwrite. We've spoken about viewing options and zooming. Let's briefly mention about selection modes. Default is cursor arrow. If I move this clip, it's going to steamroll over the neighboring clips. That's the default when you move a clip around in the timeline. So one thing I always find good to do when you're working in a new program is click and drag something, but don't release. Keep holding on the mouse. And as you're moving it, press the modifier keys and see what happens. Alt. Okay, so you can see pressing Alt while you're clicking and dragging a clip will mean that there's not going to be a gap. So it's going to insert it, and it's going to move the neighboring footage around. Okay, so see that? I'm still holding with the mouse. I will release Alt, and it goes back to its default behavior. So the Alt modifier is very handy if you don't want to overwrite a clip. You want that clip that you're overwriting to actually still be in place before you drop the clip. Well, that Alt modifier is super handy there. And like I say, you can change your mind as long as you're not releasing the clip before you change your mind. That's pretty handy. So again, I'm going to deselect here by pressing Alt and X, and it gives me a nice view again. The default behavior at the edges of the clip is going to crop the clip and leave a gap. If you hover over the clip barrier, you get this double-ended roller, and that's going to, if there was handles, let me just make some handles. Handles are non-used portions of the clip. As long as there's handles, you should be able to move where the cut happens. Okay. If you're doing that a lot, it means you should probably be in trim mode. When you're in trim mode, not only does the pointer change to a slip tool, allowing you to slip the footage. Again, you're going to need some handles. I don't have many handles on this footage here, so it's not slipping by much, but you can see the idea. That's one thing that happens in trim mode, which is, by the way, accessed by pressing the shortcut T instead of A. But another thing that happens in trim mode is that when you attempt to crop off a clip, the neighboring clips will be moved. This is advantageous if you haven't reached your picture lock, because it means that it doesn't leave a gap. But just be aware, if you're picture locked, you're going to be changing your overall timeline duration if you're doing that, and you can see the offset there as well. Another thing to point out, back to normal mode, is if you're not linked, sorry, let me undo that, and just select the single clip and move that. It's going to warn you that you've got an offset going on there. So it's good to just be aware of that. Whether or not it's a problem is up to what you're trying to do. If you don't need the audio, I would suggest getting rid of it. This is another thing that stumped me at first. When you delete something, the button that you use determines how it's deleted. Pressing the delete key might get rid of neighboring clips, whereas if you press Backspace, it's going to delete just that one clip, and it's not going to ruin your timeline. So I hope you find that very useful. And by the way, I'll put these shortcuts on a document, and I will share it underneath the video, so you don't have to remember all these shortcuts, but you do need to know them, because otherwise Resolve will misbehave and cause a lot of stress. And the worst thing is, you might not realize until it's the wrong time and you've already done some editing down the road, which is why I thoroughly recommend duplicating the timeline every now and then. Unfortunately, there's no shortcut for this. We need to select the timeline, go to Edit, Duplicate Timeline. Then gives us a copy of the timeline, which is identical. And if we change the copy, the original is preserved. We can still get those clips from the original, copy them into the duplicate. So there's advantages to that for sure. Right, so let's just see a couple of other shortcuts that we have. If we hold Shift while dragging vertically, the clip isn't going to move horizontally. That can be quite useful if you want to make space for incoming video, incoming audio, but you want to lock the timing. We've covered Alt Drag already. Alt dragging will sort of ripple insert, whereas if you don't Alt, the default will overwrite and leave a gap. So a bit like what I say when I'm teaching the Avid Media Composer, one will overwrite, but at least it won't knock the timing off. Whereas the other is dangerous in a different way, because it can potentially rechange your timing, but at least it won't get rid of the underlying footage. Okay, markers might be useful in certain situations. Flags are for entire master clips, but markers can be added by pressing M. It's going to give you a default blue marker 1, 2, 3, but if you want to add a more intelligent marker, Ctrl M gives you the option to add particular colors and names. And you can double click to remove the markers. This can be quite handy if you have comments for different people. Let's say director, audio. You might put them with director color green, audio purple, so that different people have different markers to look at. That can be quite useful. Now, clip selection. Let's say I want to move all clips to the right hand side. There's a couple of shortcuts to know how to do this. The first one is Y. So Y will select everything under the cursor and everything to the right. Let me just get something else on another channel. So I want to show you that Y only works for the selected channels. So be very careful which channels are selected, and do not press this button unless you want to purposely ignore a channel from being selected, and do not lock a channel unless you've got a strong reason as well. Be careful of these two, and be careful of what's selected, I would just say generally speaking. So Y is selecting all clips forward on a track, but only on the track selected. Let's say I want to get everything selected so I can create a gap here. The shortcut for that is Alt-Y. So Alt-Y, show that again, will select everything under the cursor to the right, whereas Ctrl-Alt-Y will select everything under the cursor and left. So that's how you go about creating big gaps in your project if you're doing those very stressful big moves of group clips from one to another. So yeah, just to emphasize again, you've got some options on the track there. You've got solo and mute buttons. You can mute individual clips as well, which is handy. You can leave a slug if you want to, where you can block out a certain audio clip. You can double click here. You can rename dialogue 1. Dialogue should be mono, which means one track gets processed. Okay, moving on to sound now. We're going to talk a bit more about the basics of working with audio. In order to demonstrate this in more detail, I'm going to switch to a different project. So things are going to start to look a bit more cluttered now that we've got the basics here under our belt. And just before I switch over, just want to mention as well that in order to preserve the real estate on the screen, we might need to be toggling these tabs up here off and on. That doesn't change anything, it just gives us different options. So when things are too cluttered, it's a really good idea to just deselect all of these white tabs so that they're gray. And then you're kind of looking at an empty, spacious work view display. You can manage your workspaces, by the way, up in the workspace area, and you can save your own workspaces, and you can reset the UI layout, which is great if you're just in a confused state and you want to go back to how it was as default. But let's just keep things simple for now. Okay, we're going to switch, well, I'm going to switch projects. I'm going to show you something I was working on. The format resolution is slightly different because it was shot in 17:9 aspect ratio. So that means we get a different aspect ratio and a different resolution. It's not 1920 by 1080, but it's 1920 by 816 or such. And we're going to take a look at let's say we'll go into the effects library. The effects library is where you add on any effects that you want to add on to different clips. In addition to that, titles are classed as effects. So the titles are added really easily by just clicking and dragging from the titles down to the timeline. And let me just undo that. I'm going to zoom out all the way. I'm going to just add a title in empty space. and you can see that it's a very basic file. It doesn't need a whole lot of work, although you've got some nice fonts there. You can double click it. Double clicking, by the way, opens up the inspector. So it's the same as selecting and opening up the inspector. You can change the font size, and you can do some shadowing and stuff like that. So just to show you briefly, one of the things that you can do at font is you can actually have it revealing an underlying video clip. And how to do this is you have a nice video clip. So I've shot some skin. I've got a nice blue effect. I've got a title underneath. And all you need to do is set the composite mode of the video to multiply to reveal the underlying titles. You can get some really nice effects. And if you're using nice fonts, I'm using Impact, you can get a nice sort of contemporary bold look. It really depends what you're trying to do. But yeah, you can get quite advanced with titles. There's a text plus, which is the Fusion titler. But in terms of standard video effects, you can see I've got two things favorited down here. Non-additive dissolve is just my standard go-to fade. And then I've got an audio crossfade. You're somewhat restricted with effects with the free version of Resolve, but it really gets you through, so you don't need to worry about that. You've got some bars and tone generators as well, which can be useful for calibrating monitors and such. Audio effects, you can add audio effects onto individual clips, and it will render them as it goes through the clip. Or you can add audio effects onto the entire track. And I did find this a bit confusing when I was first getting to grips with Resolve, because I realized that what you can do with audio in the edit window is somewhat, well, very limited, to be honest with you. So you're forced to toggle between the Fairlight and the edit window. Now, you can have a mixer in the edit window, but it's not very smart, to be honest. Let me just hover over here. There's not really many settings on the mixer. You can change your master track level, but that's not something that you'd really be doing anyways, to be honest. Double click it to reset it to the start. Let me just hide this for a moment, because with audio, dialogue, starting point is you right click the file or a number of files. You can obviously right click together, and you can normalize audio levels to European standards of -23 LUFS. Now, without going off into a tangential conversation, it depends where your video file is going. YouTube have now changed their loudness standards to -14, but broadcast is -23, and that's a true peak amount there. So normalizing is a good way to get a ballpark figure for where your levels want to be before you do those things that we do as audio people, the clicking and the dragging and all that sort of stuff. So you can see you can change an audio level on a clip there itself by just selecting the line on the clip and dragging it up and down. Or you can hold Alt and punch in keyframes if you wanted to create just certain level changes affecting just portions of that clip. But beyond that sort of stuff, you really have to look to the Fairlight page for adding effects onto entire tracks, unless you're happy doing them in individual clips. You might be happy adding on effects onto individual clips for a while, but your computer will eventually complain because it's having to process too much. So speaking of the audio, the dialogue tracks, by the way, it does kind of hide the name, and this is another thing that I'm struggling to get to grips with, which is you have to expand the track to see what the name of it is. I'm not very fond of the way Resolve expands the tracks, because, to be honest, well, this is personal, it's different for everyone, but to me, this horizontal breaker in this vertical line is confusing to me. It's dividing a track up in a way that isn't visually making sense to my brain. So yeah, I'm just sharing, I guess. I worked through it. So, double clicking and such. But yeah, the way that it expands here, not a huge fan of. And I'm not a huge fan of the mixer in the edit view. However, the Fairlight window is good. In the Fairlight window, we've got the option to add effects onto entire tracks, which is really handy. And you might find it a bit cluttered, by the way. You have to hover over here and use the scroll wheel to get up and down to see the different options here. So I would recommend turning off the meter view for a moment, and that gets rid of the video, but also the meters take up a lot of space, because I just want to show you the true height of the mixer just so that you can see what's going on there. Here's A1, which is dialog 1. Can't double click it to rename it there. Okay, fair enough. Now, these are mono tracks because the pan indicator contains a single blue mono point. The stereo tracks have stereo green panning points. This, by the way, is for surround mixing. And the blue mono point in a stereo track is the perceived sort of sensor, if you like. We can double click on a panner, by the way, if we want to bring up some more complicated automation view of the panner. But let's just start from the top and work down through a channel strip. We're not recording any live mic in. We're not doing any feedback or any bus returns, so let's ignore. The effects. Well, we can add an effect onto the entire track by clicking the plus sign, then going to Fairlight Effects and clicking on here. And one of the options I would probably recommend as a starting point is the dialog processor. Dialog processor is a fairly friendly multi-effect bundled into one. We don't want excitement. Yeah, just trust me, you don't want to be adding that for no reason. Expander we don't want, that's the opposite of compression. But the rest we might find useful. De-rumble below a certain frequency. That's pretty much like another way of doing EQ, which we're going to look at in a moment. So dynamics and EQ are both the most common types of effects. So we don't want to double up too much. We've got options to EQ by double clicking on the EQ. We've got options to change dynamics by double clicking there. So we don't want to go and add a lot of EQ and dynamics here. But I suppose I'm just showing you that there's a couple of effects that you might want to add in at this point. De-rumble, de-pop, DS. But the compressor is a more simplified version of what we have in the other dynamics window there. That compressor is slightly more advanced. So this is a good starting point for a compressor. The idea is audio that exceeds this threshold amount of minus 23 dB, because remember, audio is inverse scale, so the closer it gets to 0, the louder it is. Audio over that threshold gets reduced by an amount defined by a ratio. The simple compressor here doesn't even deal with ratios. It protects you from that confusion by just having an amount figure 0 to 1. But essentially, the higher this amount, the more reduction is going on above minus 23. If we look at a proper compressor, it's a ratio. That's like the amount. And it's showing us here, above this threshold knee, the sound is going to be squished down. It's like a hedge. When the hedge reaches a certain height of volume, it's going to get cut. What that means is really important. If you're punching in hundreds of keyframes to try and reduce only the loud parts of your dialogue after you've normalized or before you've normalized, if you use a compressor, you're saving yourself all that work because it does it for you automatically. Okay, so compressor is super handy. The EQ here as well, I would always recommend rolling off below 100 Hertz. So make sure it's enabled, and enable the different bands. And the different bands have different shapes. They're just different notches, if you like. This is a classic notch boost. So the low frequency reduction will get rid of anything below 100 Hertz there. I can't believe I can't type in there. That's crazy. Anything below 100 Hertz is going to get removed from the dialogue track. And that's really important because you don't want any sub frequencies cluttering up the intelligibility of the dialogue or changing the perceived loudness of your short film. And remember, you're going to play back this short film in a theatre, if you're lucky, film festivals. You do not want sub-vibration sounds from tube trains and the likes, and from trucks on roads nearby going off in the cinema because you've missed them while you're working on your short. So always edit on proper headphones that can give you proper bass response, even better, proper monitors. And you always must reference your mix on different systems, with a week or so at least to go, to give yourself time to just tidy up the low end and make sure the highs aren't too harsh as well. You could roll them off. But don't don't narrow this too much, because you're going to start removing the natural tone of the human voice and all of your sound effects in this general region, the center region. If you've got problematic sound, the general idea is to boost, to sweep along the frequency curve and find the frequency where you've got the annoying hiss, and it's going to be amplified quite a lot. And after that, you can just reduce it. So this process is called sweeping. You sweep through, find the nastiness, and then you can just reduce the gain. So you can see that clicking and dragging the points is like using the two of these together, but you can do them one at a time if you prefer. And the Q factor is referring to how narrow or wide the width of the frequency point you're working with. With dialogue, you might want to just leave it there as a starting point. On your different tracks, for example, sound effects, you don't want to get rid of this stuff, because this is the good stuff that's going to shake the room when that bomb explosion goes off, for example, or whatever your sound effect is. So, ask yourself how much of those frequencies you want on those channels, which is why the convention of working with audio tracks in video editing programs, NLEs, is that you break them up into dialogue, into ambient, into sound effects. Looking here, you might see that I've got a couple of strange things going on with these buttons here. Let me explain this. These channels are going to the main mix through this default button selected number 1. I have the option of sending these channels, instead of going to the main mix, or as well as, I can route them to what's called a submix. That submix then goes to the main mix. This is quite useful, for example, if you've got certain channels that you want to share common effects. These ones are reverb channels. I want an echo on these channels, on these sound effects. Some are stereo, some are mono. They're not going to the main mix, but I can still hear them because they're going to the submix, which is routed to the main mix here. On the submix, I have a huge reverb, and therefore these tracks are receiving an effect not as an insert on their individual channels, but on the sub track. And I can also send a copy of them to a second sub track if I wanted to, or to the mix at the same time. But don't do that for the sake of it. There's a reason. We're effectively creating a sub track for a very common group effect, such as EQ, compression, or reverb, and we're only sending the channels that we want to have that sub effect to those sub effects. In the Fairlight bus format, that's where we actually manage what sub effects we have on. We can add more sub effects on. You always want a stereo. Even if you've got mono channels, you want them running through stereo groups so that you can affect the stereo groups as stereo files. Okay, let's bring back the meters and the video. Now there is a way of getting the main fader visible horizontally. To do that, we need to select index, select this button here, and we get our main on there. Make sure that it's visible. That gives us a horizontal view of our loudness over time, which is really handy if we want to see the loudness of our video compared to 0 here, which is 0 there. But let me be very clear on this to clear confusion on Resolve. Up here, you've got a loudness meter. Down here, you've got faders. If I play some audio back, there's a difference between what the fader is telling me and what the loudness meter is telling me. That's because the loudness meter is decibels. Sorry, I mean the master fader is decibels, but the loudness meter is set to measure differently. It's set to measure European loudness over time. So this is an average reading of loudness and the deviation from the -23 as set by this EBU setting here. So what that means is when we're hitting -23, it's going to show us on this 0 space here. But when we're going louder than -23, like -20 or -18 or 16 or -12 or -8 or -6, it's going to show above 0 because 0 is -23. That's different to the master fader, which is showing us the true decibel value. So -23 down here should correspond to 0 here if this is set properly. Now you can set this differently. If you want to set to YouTube, it would be -14, and then 0 here would be -14 down here. I do appreciate that's a bit confusing, but it can help to have the loudness history turned on, because then you can see how the loudness of that section is behaving against your set measure of loudness that you've defined up here. So I won't say any more on that because I would like to take any of your queries individually. But yeah, the Fairlight page gives us the extra control from the mixer that we don't have otherwise on the edit page. So I question the mixer being on the edit page. I mean, I'm very much open to anyone's knowledge on how to get more use out of it. Please do get in touch, but I do struggle a bit with that. But there's so many great reasons to use Resolve. So this is my friend Miguel here. This is one of the best reasons to use Resolve. Or let's look at Joseph here. If I go onto the color tab, I've already colored this clip. This is the node to show that I've got some processing on the clip. Without going into coloring, because that's a separate topic covered by a separate video if you look at my YouTube channel, I just want to show you that if you do decide to color on a clip in Resolve, it will change the behavior, the appearance of the clip in the edit view. So this is ungraded. This is a nice dynamic range, but it looks a bit washed out. It's a bit kind of gray, doesn't really pop. And the scopes will show us that in the color view. Whereas if I turn off the bypass I've got there on the grade, it pops into life and you can see the dynamic range really matching out. So this was shot on an FS7, so you got tons of dynamic range, tons of headroom in the highlights and the shadows. But the grade will obviously make use of that space. And whatever you do in the grade updates in the edit in real time. Also, if you had a shot for some reason that was shaky and you wanted to stabilize that, well, just go into the color page and you can use the tracker tool in the stabilizer mode, and you can run the track there, which is quite useful. By pressing this button, stabilize, it will compute the axis of stabilization, the vertical, the horizontal, and what it does is it slightly punches in on the image, it scales in, it get some room from the edges of the frame to try and move the frame intelligently based upon these axes that it's computing to reduce the perceived shake. And you can change with the settings there. If the stabilization has been too extreme, you can try different settings and you'll get stronger stabilization. But remember that if you change any of these settings, including perspective, similarity, translation, you need to restabilize the footage, otherwise you're not looking at updated stabilization. So this is partially stabilized. Quite cool. But I'm all about that shake. I'm all about that shake for this clip anyways, so I haven't stabilized it. So that's a glimpse of the power of how you can utilize the color tab in conjunction with the edit tab. The Fairlight tab as well is necessary to get that full control over the audio. But don't forget as well, you can always do an AAF export if you want to get your project into Pro Tools, Reaper, or any other digital audio workstation for more advanced processing, including more advanced control over the average loudness and more advanced monitoring there. Just make sure that you export it as an AAF file. And by the way, in the Fairlight mixer, when you're adding effects on, if you've got some VST effects added in separate folders, you can pull them into Resolve. But it doesn't understand as many different types of VSTs as other audio applications, which is why I would prefer to get it into another program and add some loudness meters. There's a great loudness meter while I'm at it. It's called the Julian loudness meter. I'll just show you here. It's completely free and you can run it on any audio software. It's going to show you a nice indication of that -23 range, or you can change it, but it gives you a nice histogram over time. And you can also press a button on the bottom right down here and it will show you what's called dynamic range. It's worth saying as well that movies are cinematic. They have big differences between the loud and the quiet parts, and you really feel that in a cinema. Sometimes too much, it's too jarring. I don't like a jump scare. But TV or more daytime stuff, in the same way that lighting is more just sort of evenly done so that you can just see it, less dramatic approach for daytime TV. It's the same for audio. There's less dynamic range. Whereas for evening viewing, for cinematic viewing, or if you're watching good drama, it's actually lit like a film, or the sound has dynamics like a film. So think of dynamic range just like lighting. It can be sort of daytime and reduced. In other words, just sort of like a fairly unimaginative but consistent level, or it can be very dynamic and dramatic. Okay, so I'll wrap it up there because they're all the basic features of Resolve, and I think we've covered most of those settings pretty well. There's some more advanced stuff. I mean, we've got some keyframes, and we could punch in different keyframes in different ways. The inspector is really where all of the advanced clip settings take place, and they each have these diamonds to punch in keyframes. So depending on what effect you're working with, you can punch in effect graphs, and you can manually change them to different sorts of graphs to ease in. But yeah, I think we've covered all the basics there, and you can find a lot more information in the help documentation. And you can link to the websites there as well. But those are all the things that jumped out at me as the sort of things that tripped me up, the things that I found most useful. Backspace versus delete was one of the big ones. Once you're ready to go to the rocket, which is the deliver tab. And it's going to render your entire timeline into out. It's showing me the ungraded clip because that's where I left it. And try and avoid the presets, go for custom, choose your, this is called body, so it's going to be V8 or whatever, point it to your desktop, export the video, QuickTime, depending on what codecs you've installed on your machine. You might go DNx HD. I've been exporting for web drafts, so I've been using H.264. You can see the resolution is going to match the sequence, which is going to match your footage. So 1920 by 1080 is normal for HD, 25 frames a second. And if you're exporting H.264, by the way, you can manually force the keyframes to be every frame if you want. Bear in mind that if you're picking it up in another application, you want keyframes every frame, because long GOP codecs that drop some information between frames, they cause some sync issues for sound applications. So even if you're doing a compressed video, get into the habit of keyframe every frame. That's all fine. So go to audio and just make sure that your PCM 24 bits, and you're good. Add to render queue, and it will add to the queue in the right. Start render, and you're done. You can do other things while it's in the render queue as well, depending on your computer processor. So I hope you found that useful, and please do get in touch if you've got particulars you'd like me to cover in more detail, or just add comments. Thanks.